Good people, this is the new XPS 15 from Dell that's been updated for 2022. Now, the XPS lineup has been known for its impeccable build quality, display, keyboard, and that massive but controversial trackpad, which I'll get to shortly. Now, this year's model gets the Alder Lake and DDR5 treatment, and if you've been following our laptop content, these new 12th Gen CPUs haven't really won any awards in terms of power efficiency. So how does that translate to a relatively thin and light laptop that's geared towards mainstream performance? Spoiler alert, you're actually in for a surprise. Oh, and I should also mention that we're gonna be putting this up against last year's model with a 11th Gen CPU. So that's gonna be an interesting comparison. But before I get into all that stuff, I wanna talk about pricing and availability because this thing starts at a tad less than $1,500. Now for that, you get a Core i5-12500H with 4 performance cores and 8 efficiency cores for a total of 16 threads, 8 GB of DDR5 memory, half a terabyte of storage, and a 500 nit Full HD Plus display with UHD graphics. Now, if you want to step it up with a discrete GPU, you'll have to pay around $1,900, which then upgrades the CPU to an i7-12700H with more threads, twice the memory, and an RTX 3050 with 4 gigs of GPU memory with a TGP of 40 watts. And if you want a bit more power on the GPU side, there is a 3050 Ti option for an extra $100. Do note that this is a spec that we have over here. But if you want to go balls to the walls with your setup, you can actually load this thing up with an i9-12900HK CPU, 64 gigabytes of RAM, 2 terabytes of SSD storage, a 3.5K OLED display option for $3,400 US. Yeah, that's a lot of money. Now, personally, that's a spec that I would completely avoid since I know for a fact that I won't be able to take full advantage of that faster CPU. Also, that base model is a complete ripoff, guys. The fact that you're not getting a discrete GPU and only 8 gigs of RAM for that price is, it's truly perplexing. The sample that I have over here isn't too bad, and from using this for the past few weeks, I think this is better in every way compared to last year's model. So first things first, the design hasn't changed all that much. Dell has still stuck to their tried and trusted mantra of simplicity with the XPS 15. I will go on the record and still say that this is one of the best built Windows laptops in the market. The aluminum unibody construction and the chamfered edges, along with the carbon fiber palm rest, it all ties down to an incredible experience when you're handling this on a daily basis. They do offer this thing in Arctic White, which looks absolutely sick, and I'm sure Dave Tootie would approve, but I would have loved to see a charcoal gray option just to change things up every now and then, but you know, I hope to see that sometime next year. With that being said, the hinge is beautifully smooth and you can open it with just one hand. There's barely any wobble when you're typing. The edges are magnetic, so when you close the laptop, it gives you that satisfying snap that just literally made me feel like I was using a MacBook Pro. Portability isn't going to be a problem with this laptop. It only weighs around 4.3 pounds, which is roughly 2 kilos with the OLED display. But if you spec this laptop with a smaller battery, the 56 watt-hour version, you'll shave another pound, and the Z height is only 0.71 inches or 18 millimeters, which is very similar to last year's model. The power cable is pretty compact as well. It charges the laptop via USB Type-C. Honestly, you won't even notice this thing inside your backpack. Speaking of which, I've actually been looking for a sleek and compact backpack to accommodate the XPS 15 since I've been traveling with it between my home and the office during my testing period, and I came across Brevite. Now, they offer a very tasteful selection of backpacks that blends in really well with my personal style, and I'm sure yours as well. The materials are top-notch, it's water-resistant, machine washable, and it has easy access to the camera compartment that houses my Fuji camera that I take with me every single time to take photos and things like that. It also hosts a bunch of accessories. Thanks to Brevite for sponsoring this video. Now, back to the XPS 15, and the interior space once again has remained unchanged. You get the same keyboard layout with the built-in fingerprint sensor that works really well. The keys are one of my favorites. For a low-profile setup, these are superb. There's a good amount of travel distance and they don't feel shallow. It's also backlit in white and it gets pretty bright in low light conditions. The trackpad is still big and better this time. For starters, it still features a glass surface for that precise and smooth navigation experience, but there were no rattles or any dead zones that some users have been experiencing with their XPS 15s a couple years ago or a couple generations ago. So they've certainly improved on the quality control aspect with these newer models, which I do appreciate. Port selection on this laptop is not the greatest, and you should be expecting that considering the size. So on the left-hand side, you get a Kensington lock, 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports with DisplayPort pass-through and power delivery. Switching over to the right-hand side, you get an audio jack, a full-size USB 3 card reader, and a USB Type-C 3.2 Gen 2 port. Now, I was hoping for a better quality DAC on this laptop compared to last gen, but unfortunately, it's still pretty terrible. There's no resolution with the bass response. I mean, comparing this to my MacBook Pro, it's a day-night difference, guys. I mean, there's just so much resolution that's just lost with this laptop. Not to mention the Waves Max Audio Pro software that has 3D audio is completely useless. It sounds terrible and the driver crashes quite often. So really, I think Dell needs to fine-tune that area because it's still really, really bad. This is what the webcam looks like on the new XPS 15, and unfortunately, it's still using the same 720p sensor compared to last year. Honestly, I was hoping for an upgraded 1080p sensor this time with slightly better detail, but it still looks very bad. The microphone even sounds worse. They haven't made any improvements in this area. Actually, if I just stop talking, you can actually pick up some coil whine stuff happening with the internal components. You can't actually hear it, but when you're listening to it right now, I think the microphone that's right over there, it's just picking up all that stuff, which is, again, super disappointing for a laptop that costs $3,000, or actually $2,000 with the model that I have over here. The speakers are really good on the XPS 15. There are 2 front-facing drivers and a couple of bottom-facing ones underneath the edges, and the end result is significantly higher output compared to something like my MacBook Pro. But I will say that while the trebles are detailed, the bass response isn't that great. The Mac actually has more body to the sound versus this, it just sounds a little bit thinner. Honestly, with this, you're just getting a louder experience that just needs a little bit more life. On the positive side, the display is absolutely stunning. Now I have the 3.5K OLED display option and the colors are super vibrant. You also get those punchy blacks, which is an OLED staple, and the color gamut is off the charts. As you can see, it covers 100% sRGB, 95% Adobe RGB, and 100% P3. The 16:10 aspect ratio is awesome to fill with content. The brightness levels are not that bad. The sustainable peak level that I was able to get my sample was around 353 nits. And honestly, for an OLED display, that sounds about right. I got the same numbers with the XPS 13 OLED that I reviewed last year. But if you need more, you can opt for a 4K display or a cheaper 1200p 500 nit matte display. Personally, that's the spec that I would get all day, any day, because you get that 1:1 scaling ratio and you don't have to deal with 4K and Windows 11 scaling stuff. So that's what I would recommend. Also, I was hoping for a higher refresh rate option this time since all the display flavors cap out at 60 Hz. I mean, again, I'm used to gaming laptops featuring 144 Hz, 240 Hz, 120 Hz screens. So maybe I'm asking for too much, but I mean, at least 90 Hz would have been a really cool upgrade from last year. Now, if you look at upgradability, it is a bit difficult to get to, but once you're in, it's actually pretty generous. As you can see, there are 2 RAM slots that can be easily accessed. Maximum supported capacity is 64 gigabytes. The primary NVMe SSD is right over here, and the drive speeds are really fast. My sample got over 6.6 gigabytes per second on read and around 4.5 gigabytes per second on write. That's a huge improvement over last year's model, guys. We're talking twice the performance, which is really good. There is an additional M.2 slot for expansion, which is awesome. And if you're looking for a screw to secure that drive, I think one of these pre-installed ones located under the lid will do the trick, but correct me if I'm wrong, because I used it and it worked out just okay. All right, so now it's time to get into the meat and potatoes of this video. Performance. And there are a few things that I need to discuss about how the XPS 15 behaves, because Dell actually gives you a ton of different options that are a bit more buried in the My Dell app. Basically, Optimize is what comes out of the box, which is supposed to blend performance, temperatures, and noise depending on the situation. Then there's Cool, which runs the components at the lowest possible temperature, while Quiet prioritizes silence over everything else. Finally, Ultra Performance is supposed to turn the dial up to 11 and maximize performance by increasing input power and boosting fan speeds. So if you look at quiet mode, it limits power to 30 watts, and even under a full core workload, the fan speeds barely spin up. But performance takes a beating. Cool, on the other hand, is basically a clone of the quiet mode with those low clock speeds, but a bit higher noise levels to push temperatures downwards by about 3 degrees. Personally, I feel like this mode is pretty pointless. Now, if you look at optimized and ultra performance, they're actually pretty similar, with ultra performance pushing fan speeds just a bit more, while offering quite higher frequencies and the same temperatures. And yes, just 3 watts can boost clock speeds by just over 300 megahertz on some Alder Lake CPUs, especially once you go above 45 watts. Now, the other thing I need to mention here is the noise levels. This is actually one of the quietest laptops that I've ever tested, even when it's running at the highest performance mode. Exterior temperatures are also really well managed, guys, with the hottest areas pushed away from either your hands or your legs. Also, all the hot air is exhausted towards the back, and while that does heat up the screen area a bit, there is nothing to worry about. The nice thing about all of this is that it avoids heating up your mouse hand, which is super important. And also remember, this is under a full core workload, which is the absolute worst case scenario. Now, if you look at the GPU, the RTX 3050 Ti is handled pretty much the same as the CPU. Cool and quiet run at lower clock speeds. So cool basically lowers temperatures by just a little bit more. Meanwhile, optimized and ultra are basically identical, which might seem a bit weird when you consider the average GPU power. But the ultra performance mode seems to be temperature limited by Dell rather than power limited. So even though it uses about 12% more power than optimized, it only gets a tiny 60 megahertz boost. So now that we know how everything behaves, I think it's important to understand that the XPS lineup is a bit unique when you compare it to a lot of the other laptops that I've tested in the last few months. Now, this isn't a gaming laptop by any stretch of the imagination, and I want to emphasize that point highly. Instead, it's a portable productivity laptop that can do some gaming if you really need it to. But its focus is really on professionals who want to maximize on battery life, size, and weight without sacrificing all that much performance. So that means the best comparison is probably the improvement over the previous generation of XPS that came out last year. Its specs and power envelopes are really similar, and back when it was released, it was about the same price as this model. The other models range from the Zephyrus G14 with AMD 6900HS all the way up to the crazy expensive top-tier Blade 15 with its 12900H and an RTX 3080 Ti. Meanwhile, the Nitro 5s are here more of as a spec comparison since they're really in a whole other budget category. And I want to kick things off with battery life. Now, this is the first Alder Lake laptop that I'm actually impressed with, guys. It's a heck of a lot better than the 9210 from last year, and it even manages to beat the Zephyrus, probably because Dell equipped it with a pretty big battery for such a thin laptop. And there's also a bit of a secret sauce here as well. Now, I'm sure why you're all wondering why this thing gets such good battery life when every other laptop with Intel's newest CPUs gets destroyed in this test. Now, after talking to Dell, I think I've got a pretty good idea about what's going on. Supposedly, Alder Lake and Windows 11 still don't get along all that well, and CPUs have problems going into an ultra low power mode during light load scenarios like browsing the web. So instead of the efficiency cores taking the workload while the performance ones go into like a dormant state, all the cores stay active. And to fix that, Dell optimized their BIOS in a way that stops Windows from screwing things up most of the time. And when you combine one of the larger batteries here with a processor that chugs back between 43 and 45 watts when under full load, it's possible to get some work done while being unplugged too. And that leads us to actual real-world performance. So as we go through these charts, it should be obvious that the biggest step Dell's made between the 2021 and 2022 models is the move to Alder Lake. I mean, the performance is like night and day. Even though it was still a super expensive model, the previous generation trailed every single laptop by a pretty big amount, but now the 12700H is actually leading the pack in a lot of cases. And yes, because of its ability to run faster for longer periods of time, the 2022 XPS 15 can actually beat the Blade 15's 12900H in most cases. That's pretty wild. The only area where it doesn't get the greatest results is in GPU accelerated apps because of the RTX 3050 Ti. Plus, the CPU and GPU power sharing on Alder Lake based laptops is done a bit differently. So in some situations, it can either be beaten or almost matched by an older version. But overall, the results are pretty good. Now moving on to gaming, and remember what I said before? This isn't a gaming laptop, and you can really see that here. These are some of the slowest results that I've ever seen, guys. But there are some positives. First of all, it does manage to beat the older model, although not by all that much. Plus, I'm comparing the XPS 15 to gaming laptops that run their GPUs at higher wattages. Yes, even the 3050 Ti on the Nitro 5 gets a lot more juice. But looking at this a different way, this thing won't have any problems getting perfectly playable frame rates in most games if you turn down the detail settings just a bit. But keep in mind that that 60 Hz screen is just going to be a really bad experience. So I would highly stay away from gaming on the XPS 15 completely. So final thoughts on the new XPS 15 from Dell for 2022. And guys, I really like this laptop. I mean, the build quality, the display, the keyboard, trackpad, this whole thing just ties to an amazing experience when you're using this every single day. But you kind of knew that. The XPS lineup is always known to give you that premium Windows laptop experience. The performance improvement over last generation is better in every way. But I was actually hoping for some improvements with the little things, like giving us a better quality webcam, because people are starting to rely on that these days. And because this is geared towards a productivity focused audience, that's like an important thing. And if they're giving us a really bad sensor, it just completely defeats the purpose. Also, that built-in DAC, I mean, I really hope they improve on those aspects as well. It's just little things that I really hope that they improve on at least next year. And also maybe change the design a little bit, you know. But yeah, on that note, thank you so much for watching. I hope you were able to take away everything that you needed to know about the XPS 15. Let us know what you guys think about it in the comments. I'm Iber with Hardware Canucks. Thank you so much for watching. And I'll talk to you guys in the next one. Oh, and spend responsibly, my friends.